Good afternoon. I'll present a brief overview of the research topic for my PhD, the questions it raises, and how I plan to go about answering them. As the title on the presentation suggests, and in a nutshell, I am studying a particular moment in the history of global environmentalism that culminated in the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment that was held in Stockholm, and specifically its impact on the conceptual foundations of international environmental law. The Stockholm Conference, as it's broadly referred to, was a first for international negotiations on the environment. It was the first time that a large number of world governments came together to discuss global environmental problems. It resulted from a long, at times rather heated, series of preparatory meetings and debates that became quickly characterized by conflictual stances between developed and developing countries. On the one hand, developed countries approached the conference with the aspiration to lead a global campaign to curb environmental pollution and really lay the foundations for a more careful management of natural resources. On the other hand, developing countries were worried about tackling environmental degradation on a global scale because they thought it might jeopardize the economic objectives that decolonization had brought about and their economic needs for growth. The Stockholm Conference was initially conceived by the superpowers of the time, US, UK, Great Britain, France and Germany, as an opportunity to take advantage of a period of detente in the Cold War when the environment was really not conceived as a political issue and in fact was deemed compatible with national security goals and even economic liberalization goals. But due to the divergence between the North and South on the environment development equation, it quickly became a highly contested political issue, which has been referred to as the world's most dangerous political issue, and led the Stockholm Conference to become a landmark for global environmentalism, and it's been referred to widely as a watershed moment, a founding moment. The conference emerged from a period of heightened environmental awareness that gathered momentum through the 60s in response to large-scale environmental disasters. There were major oil spills, mercury contaminations, and also publications that really became seminal, such as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring on the perils of DDT fertilizers, publications on overpopulation issues, on the likelihood of economic growth coming to a halt because of the physical limits of the natural world. Just to give you a few examples. The international movement that really gathered momentum during the 60s really created an opening, both intellectually, scientifically, and politically, for a new conception of the relationship between humans and nature. And then Stockholm happened in 1972, the Stockholm Conference. And that's when environment and development were linked for the first time. 20 years later, at the UN Rio Summit on the Environment and Development this time, the term sustainable development was coined, and the two elements, environment and development, were crystallized very much into a single concept, which has defined really the sustainability discourse that we still see dominate environmentalism today. We can draw many parallels in the discussions that took place in 1972 with the ones that are ongoing. I mean, if we just look at the opening address by Indira Gandhi at the time, which was reported widely calling poverty the greatest polluter of all, and then we skip 50 years ahead to the Sustainable Development Goals, which set the 2030 sustainability agenda for world governments, we see no poverty as SDG number 1. Last year in Glasgow at the COP26 negotiations, the discussion stalled on the issue of loss and damage compensation for climate change, which was requested by developing countries, very much in the same way that in 1972 developed countries rejected the call for additional funding to transition to a more ecological development model that was raised by developing countries at Stockholm. So when I'm talking about the Stockholm moment, I'm really referring to the process behind the conference. It was kickstarted with the 1968 conference on the biosphere, organized by UNESCO in Paris, which really formulated a new, broader understanding, scientific understanding of the environmental problem, one that showed appreciation for the interconnection between different life systems, and ending with the 1972 Stockholm Conference. And what I'm interested in is how this moment should be understood. The literature explored so far, that I have explored so far, has really focused on the institutional, political, and normative achievements and failures of Stockholm. But where it falls short is the analysis of the impact the conference and the broader process had on the conceptual underpinnings of global environmentalism as consecrated through international environmental law. And what do I mean when I refer to conceptual foundations, conceptual underpinnings? I really mean a specific, not obvious mindset that underpins the sustainability discourse, which we've all embraced, which has become ubiquitous over the past several decades, and which I've personally seen at work, both in an academic context, but more so when working for a large environmental NGO, which was always at pains to show that it was not anti-development and that it operated in full compliance with fundamental rights of communities in delivering its missions. And then later, when I was working for an economic development NGO, which often struggled to reconcile its economic development objectives with environmental priorities or responsibilities, which were very much framed as a cost to their projects. So essentially, this is a mindset that sees environmental protection as compatible with development, economic development, and also sharing a very synergistic relationship with human rights. But it does not deal with the inherent tensions and limitations of that framing. And these are arguably undermining the effectiveness of international environmental law, because the role it then takes is one to address the symptoms rather than the root causes and the underlying transactions that are leading to environmental degradation, as we see continuing to worsen. So my key research questions are: what was the impact, obviously, of the Stockholm moment on the conceptual underpinnings of international environmental law? But then I want to really dig deep into how this mindset emerged through the Stockholm moment. Why did that not happen at a different time, for example, later at Rio? What makes Stockholm more foundational in that respect than other choice points in international relations? And then how has that mindset crystallized, how it's become so entrenched as to continue to influence, if it does, environmental protection? And what are the implications? To answer these questions, I really have looked at different methodological frameworks that span across different disciplines. So I became quickly convinced that I would have to take a multidisciplinary approach to my research, and really try and find a framework that would address the contextual nature that the analysis calls for. I have looked at intellectual history, political science and constitutional studies of social, cultural, legal, political, institutional developments. And those tend to really look at extrapolating and testing theories from existing historical accounts, and they do so deductively. I, for the Stockholm moment, have not been able to find a theory as such, and therefore need to proceed inductively. And to build that theory, historical institutionalism is particularly useful, I believe. It is really helpful in when seeking to explain changes in development of institutions through contextual analysis. And I plan to refer to the concepts of critical junctures, those fork in the road moments that really set a political opening in place, and then through which decision makers choose a path rather than another, which tends to stay in place for some time. And to unveil the conceptual choices in that process, I will also combine frame analysis. Very useful, I believe, at looking at policy controversies, because it forces you to take a very careful contextual discursive and textual analysis to enrich your historical explanations, and to test these causal links between the Stockholm moment and then the entrenchment of a mindset, I will carry out 3 main case studies. Finally, just quickly wrap up, why do I think it's important to establish whether Stockholm was a critical juncture or not? I mean, what if it was, what if it wasn't? I think the value of my research lies in the ability to unveil the causal links and the mechanisms that may prove or disprove the entrenchment of this mindset using international environmental law as my data. This is based on the premise that there is broad agreement that we are falling short through global environmental governance to meet environmental challenges at scale. And so conceptualizing Stockholm either as a critical juncture or one that failed to be one should highlight those processes, cognitive frameworks, historical and structural factors that have made global efforts on the environment less effective than required, and also unveil different framings that were deliberately or not discarded or left out, which actually may be useful for the 20 to 30 critical decade that we've entered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that wonderful talk on the Stockholm moment. And we'd now like to open the floor to questions, if anybody has any. No? Yes, we have one here.
I found myself thinking about the contemporaneity of UNCLOS 3 with the process you're talking about, where again, you're dealing with resources, fisheries, and minerals. And I wondered if there was much conversation between the diplomats engaged in the 2 processes.
Well, sorry. I think I said UNCLOS, didn't I? Yeah. I'm sorry, United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea. Yeah. So Stockholm actually then, after the conference, I think it definitely framed the discussions on natural resources in a way that was moving towards a more ecological approach. But that window closed quite quickly. And as a result, UNCLOS was actually quite unique in terms of some of the evolution of the principles that were set, the normative principles set in there. I think from Stockholm directly, the link that I can establish was on pollution management, which really is evidenced through several multilateral environmental agreements on marine pollution that were concluded simultaneously or contemporaneously with the conference. And that's probably its more direct impact that I've been able to see so far.
Any other questions? While you're all thinking, I will exercise my moderator's privilege and ask one myself. Alice, could you speak a little bit to the role of civil society in the Stockholm moment and how important that was?
That was hugely important in terms of raising both awareness and momentum and pressure on the leaders at the conference. It's not something that I'm analyzing in detail because I'm conducting very much a textual analysis from the texts and the political actors' memoirs and meeting papers, which do not really mention that part. But there was a forum in parallel where, for the first time, civil society was really present. Big NGOs definitely played a part in the preparatory materials. They influence a lot of the thinking, but yes, it's not something I'm deliberately tracing, but it was definitely part of the context of the moment.
Okay, thank you. And unless there are any other questions, then thank you very much, Alice. And I'd like to welcome David Boroto to the stage. He'll be speaking on investigating the infrastructure enabling environment through a systems analysis to strengthen project development.
you know if this is working today?
You can use that, yeah.
Would that be the one that does it? I can just use this. It works too. No worries. Awesome. Good afternoon, folks. My name is David Boroto. I'm an MPhil student in the Engineering for Sustainable Development course, and my research focuses on investigating the infrastructure-enabling environment through a systems analysis to strengthen project development. Very long title, lots of technical jargon in there, but by the end of this presentation, I hope you'll understand these three main concepts that are the foundations of my research: infrastructure project development, the enabling environment, and a systems analysis. But to start, I want to start with a statement that grounds my research, and that's that infrastructure is the backbone of society. And it delivers all of the services that we use on a day-to-day basis, be it the lights that power this room, the water that you get through your tap, or the roads that you take on your way to work every day. It's infrastructure that enable those services that we use every day. But around the world, we don't have enough infrastructure to meet the needs of society. And these statistics kind of tell that story. More than 600 million people don't have access to good sources of drinking water. Nearly 1 billion people don't have access to electricity. 1 billion people don't live close enough to good quality roads. And nearly 2.5 billion people don't have good access to sanitation. But this isn't for a lack of trying. There's a lot that needs to happen to get infrastructure built. First, you need to come up with your plans, a vision for what infrastructure you need for your society in the future. Then preparing all of those projects that come out from your vision to a point where you have a list of viable projects that can actually be implemented. Then you take them through construction, get them built, get the physical infrastructure on the ground. And once it's there, you have people using it, and you need people maintaining it so that you can use it throughout its whole life. And there lies the first part of the problem. And you can see the first one of those circles that I mentioned earlier. As a society, we know how to come up with good plans, and we have a lot of thought and a lot of work done into that already. We're pretty good at implementing infrastructure, building it, and while there's issues in getting it done on time or on budget, we fundamentally know how to get that done. The problem is taking projects from plans, from ideas and concepts, to the point where they're ready to be implemented. And this is compounded by the fact that globally, we're just not spending as much money as we need to on infrastructure. If you look at the green line at the bottom, that's the amount of money we're currently spending, and the blue line on the top is how much we should be spending to fill that infrastructure gap. And that amounts to about $1.5 trillion per year just in developing countries. And then when you take that, it adds to a vicious cycle. When you're not spending enough money, the quality of the projects that you're developing is pretty low. And when you don't have good quality projects, it makes it challenging to then attract investors to finance the infrastructure that you need to be built. And it just compounds this issue. And this is especially true in developing countries or low and middle income countries as well, which is why this issue is particularly important to me. I was born in South Africa to parents who are from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And when I was a kid, my dad told me, you should never forget where you come from. For him, that meant never forgetting his community and family in Congo and always investing in projects there. For me, when I moved to Canada at the age of 13, it meant, one, not forgetting my roots in South Africa and Congo and on the African continent in general. But secondly, always having the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized in our society in mind. And as I went through school, that interest in tackling social issues grew into an interest in global development. And as I went through my studies in infrastructure engineering at the University of Toronto, doing this MPhil program and through some of my work experience, gained an appreciation of the fundamental role that infrastructure plays in our day-to-day lives and the role that it can play in improving the lives of the most vulnerable in society. So that's how I came to self-identify myself as an infrastructure nerd and a global development nut. And so the goal of my research and really my professional career overall is to take this interest in global development and tackling issues of poverty and marginalization and taking my background in infrastructure engineering, figuring out how we can combine those two to tackle some of these really messy issues. And so back to the problem. We see that the issue is taking projects from concept stage all the way through implementation. And I believe the enabling environment is the place to look to try and uncover some of the solutions to this problem. And so at this point, it would be a good thing to say, what is the enabling environment? Well, unfortunately, that's a part of the problem. We don't really fully understand what the enabling environment is. It's a bit of a black box that us practitioners and researchers don't have a good understanding of, and there isn't really a standard definition or conceptualization around it. And so what I'm using for this presentation and for my research is that the enabling environment are the people and the things that enable governments to take infrastructure projects all the way through the life cycle. And for us, we're going to focus specifically on that preparation stage, taking projects from concepts, from the ideas that we have in our heads, all the way through pre-feasibility, feasibility, all the way to the point where they're ready to be implemented. And so let's start with the people. There's many different actors that need to work together to make sure that infrastructure is getting built. First and foremost, we have the government, and they're the main stakeholder in this scenario. They're responsible largely for making sure that society has the infrastructure that it needs and getting it through all the way through the process. Many different agencies at different levels, federal, local, and regional. Then you have the engineers, the contractors, people responsible for doing the studies and getting the infrastructure built itself. The financiers, people who bring money to the table and help supplement governmental budgets. The asset owners, people, once the infrastructure is built, they're responsible then for making sure it can go through its whole life. And last but not least, us, the people who use and benefit from infrastructure in the day-to-day. Going on to the things, there's some structural elements that help us get infrastructure built, the policies and legislation that govern the rules of the game, the institutions that actually have to go about implementing it and how they work together to do that, and the guidelines and processes that give us best practices of how to do things well. Looking at more things related to resource and capacity, we're looking at our budgets, the financing that enables us to actually pay for the infrastructure, the capacity, the people working within governments, their knowledge and ability, and the resources that they have available to them to actually do some of these studies and get this work done. And finally, the data and evidence that help us make well-informed decisions about not only what infrastructure we're building, but how to get it across the line. And then even more things, a bit more nebulous, things that we don't understand, the social, cultural, political, economic things that we don't necessarily have as much influence on, but we know that they impact infrastructure development, and so they're just as important. So as we can see, the enabling environment is big, messy, and complex, but there's many things and there are many levers that we can pull to hopefully improve project development. And the way we hope to unpack that is through a systems analysis. Why a systems analysis? It provides us a macroscopic perspective, bird's eye view over everything that's going on, and allows us to really unpack the complexity of the enabling environment and project development, understand key relationships, and see where the leverage points that we can use to improve project development. And this will hopefully help us answer the research questions that I'm going to be investigating. How does the enabling environment and all the different parts of it affect project development? And then where are those key relationships where we can invest our resources to improve the process? And just as a preliminary systems analysis that I've done that can help show one, the power of a systems analysis for this type of work, and to kind of demonstrate the issue that we have, this is one I've put together for this presentation to kind of show it. And so if you look, we have the government who is responsible for developing plans that then undergo project preparation. Typically, you'll have the government hire engineering contractors who will implement the project preparation activities, the feasibility studies, environmental impact assessments, things of that nature. If you look all the way over to the right, government capacity is something that limits project preparation from actually happening, the inability of people to carry out these studies themselves or hire people to do it. Budgets in the bottom right corner is also something that constrains project development from happening and limits government capacity. And if you look at someone who can then intervene and kind of support this process, are infrastructure financiers of various kinds. They can both support project preparation with financing itself and also support the development of government capacity as well. But that's currently not happening, taking it back to that financing gap that we mentioned earlier. Why? Well, institutions and regulations, the rules of the game, aren't necessarily as strong in some places. So making sure that we have them in place can be something that can help attract financiers. As well, another virtuous cycle, when you don't have as much government capacity, that can limit or make it challenging for financiers to engage. So having good government capacity can help bridge that gap. Very, very small sample, but this helps demonstrate just exactly what I'm hoping to uncover as we broaden the systems map and unpack this issue. And from this, what I hope to get is a framework that can then help us understand what are the actions that we need to take to improve the enabling environment. Looking at the process along the top, elements of the enabling environment along the side, what are actions that we can give to each individual stakeholder along different priorities to help us strengthen this process. Once I have that framework, hope to apply it in a couple of countries that I've worked with before, either through school or through work. And at the end of the day, what we hope to have is a tool or a process to enable governments to understand gaps in their enabling environments and identify actions that they can take to improve their project development process so that overall we can accelerate the delivery of essential infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, we have a few.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering if you could say something a bit more about the sort of different roles played by public sector and private sector investments. I really know nothing about this, right? So it'd be interesting to see what roles they are and what obstacles there are to each kind, precipitating each kind of investment. Yeah, thanks.
So typically, like I said, it's government that's responsible for delivering infrastructure. But I think now there's a lot of recognition in the industry that for the amount of infrastructure that we need to build, just government funding won't be enough. And so that's what the private sector funding is meant to do. The challenge is from an infrastructure perspective, but then also infrastructure in a low and middle income environment perspective, private investors want a return on their investment. That's the name of the game. Infrastructure in general doesn't always do that. Infrastructure in a challenging environment, it's even harder to get that. And so the challenge now is finding creative ways to, one, make projects more attractive, but then also to make it easier and create greater incentives for the private sector to try and come in. The way it's viewed currently is that they're meant to give that additional funding to get us to where we need to go that the government just can't do by itself.
I believe there was a question. There's one at the back.
Cheers, David. Really interesting. Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned about there being a bit of a black box with enabling the environment. And it just strikes me as, why is that, considering that infrastructure is such an integral part to wider society? Is there a sort of a specific reason, or it's just gone that way? You know, why are there no frameworks in place?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not quite sure why, and that's kind of been a puzzling thing for me. I think I came across this concept at my last job working for the United Nations Office for Project Services, and them and another organization called Global Infrastructure Hub, I think, are the two main people thinking about the enabling environment. My best guess is that as engineers, we love to focus on the technical side of things, and so it's the designing the projects, the building the projects, all of that side, whereas this is very much beyond the technical, which not to say that engineers can't think like that. I think I'm hopefully proof that that's not the case, but that's not necessarily our comfort zone. And so I think that's why we don't have as much people thinking about this, because it's much, much more messy than just the technical nature of building and delivering infrastructure.
One final question. Actually, come this way.
Thank you for the talk. What kind of methods do you use to answer your research questions?
Yeah, so primarily trying to look through the literature to understand the project development process and the enabling environment itself. But I think as well, because this isn't as research a topic, a lot of it will come from having conversations and interviews with different stakeholders, primarily focused within government, but hopefully as well with different financiers as well, because I think I don't want to presume that they're going to be the solution, but they're definitely going to have a big role to play. So talking to people to understand how things work in practice, and then hopefully conceptualize and codify some of those best practices.
Wonderful. Thank you, David.
Thanks a lot.
Let's give him another round of applause. And now I'd like to welcome Lars Schaaf to the lectern.
Thank you. perfect. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we have quite an exciting journey ahead of us. We're going to be talking about a material that was only discovered 30 years ago. We're going to see that it's better than anything else at absorbing carbon dioxide. And then I'm going to try and convince you that what we really need is computational experimentation in order to optimize the carbon capture process. All right, so let's get started. The core idea is that we want to avoid emitting carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere at point sources where it really, really matters. And so what we're looking for is a material that we can put into one of these chimneys that filters out carbon dioxide. So we have gas that's filled of water with nitrogen with carbon dioxide, and what we want is that our material selectively absorbs the carbon dioxide and nothing else. Everything else passes through. We also want our magical material to be able to release the carbon dioxide again, right? So we have the material, it's released, and then we can put it back into our chimney. And then we can cycle it through and extract carbon dioxide that way. So some of you may be wondering, okay, now we have separated the carbon dioxide. What does that help us? What do we do with it? So carbon dioxide is actually quite a valuable resource. We can use it to create other molecules, other chemicals, but we also use it in the food industry and to purify water. And actually we had a shortage of it at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, so I've talked a lot about this magical material. What kind of materials do this? So one material that does this are zeolites. These are these really cool three-dimensional structures that have pores, that have these cavities. And the idea is that carbon dioxide has a lot of surfaces where it can attach to. So it kind of can just stick to all of these surfaces. And what happens when we reduce the pressure after we've taken out our zeolite is that the carbon dioxide releases, at least some of it does. Now, the only issue is with current state-of-the-art methods, we would need 30% of the energy we get from burning fossil fuels to capture the carbon dioxide, and that's just not good enough, right? And so, can we do better? And yes, we can. So these are these very new type of materials called metal organic frameworks. And here, if we reduce the pressure by the same amount, we release a lot more carbon dioxide. And I just want to emphasize that this is pretty incredible. So the shape that you see there, that is very counterintuitive. How on earth do you have something where you slightly change the pressure and then all of a sudden it just releases all of the carbon dioxide? What's going on, right? And to understand that, we really need an in-depth understanding of our system. We need to understand it at the atomic scale. So, and the secret really lies here. It lies in these small molecules that protrude in this porous structure. So let's have a look at the atomic scale. All right, so people in this study found that actually what causes this sharp increase is cooperative behavior. So we have these three-dimensional structures, and we're looking along one of these tunnels. And I don't really like looking at these chemical structures that much, so let's replace it with something a little simpler. Here, what you see is a bunch of adsorption sites in a row. And what they found is that when one carbon dioxide adsorbs to one of these sites, the neighboring site is much easier to adsorb to. So it's much easier to add a carbon dioxide there. And so what you get is this kind of chain reaction that I just skipped there, that you just get a lot of carbon dioxide absorbed. And that's what creates this sharp peak. Now, you may say, okay, great, Lars, this all sounds quite nice and plausible. How do you know this is the case? And the reason we know is because we have to do experiments, right? We need to see that that's actually what's happening. And what we can do is we can do NMR. So NMR is very similar to what you would get if you hit your head, went to the hospital and got an MRI scan. And what you get is these kind of peaks. And actually, it's basically impossible to see that those peaks correspond to this structure right here. And so we're in a bit of trouble. We have all of this information, but it's kind of hidden. And what really saves us is that we have a good understanding of the physical laws that govern these kind of systems. So what we can do is we can calculate what would a spectrum look like if we had this structure on a computer, and then we can compare it to what we see experimentally. So let's say we have two mechanisms, right? Mechanism A and B. We can calculate both of them, see what the spectrum should look like, and then we can compare it to experiment, and in this case we see, okay, it's mechanism A, right? All right, so how do we create these simulations? When we when we try to describe things at the atomic scale, we really need to consider quantum mechanics. So ultimately what we'd have to do is solve this equation down here, the Schrödinger equation. Now that's very hard, okay? Very, very hard. What we really want is we want to give a structure, and then we want to know what are the forces on all of our atoms, what are the energies. And then when we know that, we can evolve the system in time, and then it's kind of hard to see, but those atoms are actually moving back and forth. And then we can see how do the atoms at such a small scale actually move, and that purely based on our understanding of the physical world. But the problem is it's expensive. It's so expensive that we can't do a lot of the things that we'd like to simulate. And so instead, what we do is we create machine learning models that replace this and make it much faster to create these simulations. And I'm talking a factor of 1,000, 10,000, so very significant, and this allows us to do a lot of very cool stuff. All right, so you may say, okay, machine learning, that's fantastic. You have your structure, and we know what we're training on. Let's just put it into any old machine learning framework, and we should get results, right? So things are a little complicated, and we see that immediately when we start to describe the structure. So how do we describe the structure up here? We can take just the list of positions as a list, right? And we put it into our machine learning, and then hopefully we get some forces out. So the issue with doing that is that we need to obey the symmetries of nature. So if we have this configuration here, very simple, 2 atoms, right? And we change the order of the list, then our descriptor changes, but in reality, nothing has changed about our system, right? Similarly, if we look at the atom from this angle, and then we change perspective and we look at it from a different angle, nothing has changed about the atoms themselves, only our perspective. And so clearly our description is changing, but the system isn't really. So there's some symmetries in our system, and similarly, if you did the experiment over there and I do it right here, should be the same. And so we want to create a descriptor that doesn't change when we create these symmetries. And one way to go about that is to sequence all of our environments, our energy, by saying each atom gets an energy. Each atom gets an energy, and the energy depends on what it sees around it. So we create this descriptor that's around each atom, and then we sum all the energies, and we get a total energy. Now this is a big approximation, but it works. It gets rid of this problem of translational invariance and changing the labels. So it gets rid of that. And then we can basically also rotate our structure and then average across it to get this rotational symmetry out of the way. And so now we have a description of our system that doesn't depend on all of these things, and we can start training a machine learning model. Important thing to note here is that it's not just about making sure that we don't include as many training environments, but we really need to have these symmetries in our description, otherwise it's not physical. It's just not how nature works, and we would get horrible results, and that's what was initially holding this back when people started doing these kind of approaches. And there's been a lot of revolution in terms of how we best describe these kind of systems. All right, great. So now what we do is we create our structures, we convert it to descriptors, and then we can use whatever machine learning tool we want to use. We can use some Gaussian process regression, we can use neural networks, we can even do linear regression, which is pretty mind-blowing, so very simple model. And then we get really nice simulations. So this here is a simulation I ran from my small computer. It took 5 minutes, so the time it takes to make a coffee. And if you would run this on a massive cluster, so a really big supercomputer that costs a lot of money to run things on, it would take roughly 5 days. And so here, yeah, it's quite small, but these atoms are moving, trust me. So now with these much faster things, we can look at much more complicated mechanisms. We can try and optimize these metal organic frameworks to absorb carbon dioxide better, to make sure it only absorbs carbon dioxide, that it doesn't get hindered by, for example, water in the gas. And we can improve their carbon capture capabilities even further. And we could never gain this insight if we wouldn't have computational experiments and if we wouldn't have machine learning tools to do it, because there's no other way to go about it. All right, so I want to quickly wrap up. The thing you saw today is that these very cool structures are very good at capturing carbon dioxide, that we need computational tools to understand experimental observations, and that in order to run these simulations, we need faster methods than just using quantum mechanics directly. And the way of doing this is through machine learning. With that, I'd like to finish off. Thank you very much for paying attention. That's it.
Thank you, Lars, for that really engaging talk. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask him? Yes, Alice? Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, Professor.
Thank you very much, Lars. I know nothing about the subject, but it was very good. Have you got any idea, or are you factoring in what the carbon footprint of these metal frameworks might be to run on a large scale?
Okay,
carbon capture absorb.
So one of the issues is actually that current metal organic frameworks that can do this very well is that they actually have a lot of toxic compounds and very expensive compounds inside. And more environmentally friendly chemicals that you include inside these metal organic frameworks perform worse. And so this is exactly kind of the issue we have when we run things in a lab and it's small, it's all good, but if we really want to manufacture them, we're going to need a lot, like you say. And so that is a massive challenge. There are some alternatives, but currently they don't perform as well. And so yes, this is part of the thing that we want to optimize by looking at more complicated molecules, but that are friendlier for the environment. So thanks for that great question.
So thank you. It was a lovely question. So when I saw your cooperative curve, that's what hemoglobin does, right? So I mean, it's precisely what an evolved biological molecule does to take in oxygen and then drop it off cooperatively. Is anybody, this is off the wall and it's not what you're doing, but thinking of using biological molecules which have evolved to have just this behavior of taking in gases at high concentrations and dropping them off at low?
So I don't know. I assume some of the challenges that would be associated with that is being under these kind of conditions. So we have an exhaust gas that's at very high temperature and pressure. How do you get these kind of molecular things to be stable? So I think that would be a core challenge, specifically for this. Maybe there's other areas where you could do carbon capture with them. I have no idea. But from a modeling standpoint, this is an extremely interesting area of research. And the reason these biological structures are so interesting is because we have another expansion of length scale. We have even bigger systems. So here, the things you see, the way we simulate them, is we repeat the same thing infinitely in all directions. With molecules or with big proteins or whatever, you can't do that. So you really need to simulate 30,000 atoms or something like that. And so the question of doing anything on a biological scale is extremely interesting from this kind of modeling perspective. And in terms of carbon capture, I do not know if this is currently being investigated, but yeah. Thank you.
And our last question is from the back.
Now, I may have misheard you or misunderstood you, but I thought you said that you could run the simulation on your computer in 5 minutes, but using a bigger, more powerful machine would take days. Mm-hmm. If I did hear that correctly, why is that?
Okay, so this was maybe I didn't say this clearly enough. So if we were to run the quantum mechanical simulation by itself, it would take maybe a month on my local computer, and it would take maybe 5 days on a supercomputer. But if we then learn from these quantum mechanical simulations and create a machine learning model that can predict the outcome of these calculations instead of calculating them, then we can run it much quicker. So it would maybe take a few seconds on a supercomputer. It takes 5 minutes on my small computer. So this is the speed up we get by creating a machine learning model that we can use as an alternative that's almost equally accurate as our proper physical simulation. And so we don't have to run these very expensive calculations. Instead, we can use our machine learning model. I hope that clarifies that, but thanks for asking that clarification. Yeah. Perfect, that was it. Thank you very much.
And now our final speaker of the day is Rubén Asiaín Mira, who's going to talk to us about human urine.
Yes, here it is. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rubén Asiaín Mira, and I'm a PhD student that conduct my research jointly at the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology here in West Cambridge, and in the Spanish water company Aqualia. And today, I want to talk to you about how we transform a waste that you all know very well, human urine, into a resource, energy. So I'm going to assume that you all recognize this location. Well, Cambridge has around 110,000 inhabitants. And do you know how much urine do we all of us produce here? Well, the answer is more than 150,000 liters per day. And I can imagine that this number may not tell you a lot. So this will be equivalent to have more than 800 baths full of urine produced every day, just here in Cambridge. So yeah, quite a lot, I know. And do you know what happens with this big volume of urine that we produce? Well, it is part of what we call wastewater, together with other liquid waste streams that come from households, from industries, from the sewer system, etc. So at the end, this very complex wastewater stream reach a centralized wastewater treatment plant where we remove all the pollutants before we discharge to the river. And let me tell you that some of these pollutants are very expensive to remove in terms of energy, especially the nitrogen. So going back, and I spoiled this, to this 800 baths full of urine that sounded like a lot of volume, in reality, it's less than 1% of the total volume of this urban wastewater. But this urine contributes to more than the 80% of the nitrogen that comes to wastewater treatment plants. So very tiny piece of volume, but most of the nitrogen there. So there's business. Okay, and this nitrogen in the urine is found in the form of urea. As you can see in the formula, it has hydrogen in the structure. So we can potentially recover it and use it to produce energy. Sounds great. So that's exactly what my research is about. How can we recover energy from human urine? So for doing so, we apply segregated systems. So we collect the urine directly at the toilet when it's produced. And then we have designed a three-step process. So first, we remove the urea from the urine using activated carbon. We then apply a thermal treatment to this carbon to produce ammonia and regenerate the carbon again. And finally, with the ammonia that we produce hydrogen, which is the final energy vector. So let's talk now about each step of the process a little bit more in detail. So as I say, the first step of the process is the removal of the recovery of the urea from urine using activated carbon through an adsorption process. I think Lars introduced before what adsorption is, but just for you to have an idea, is a separation technique that for you and me to understand is like a filtration. So we remove the urea and keep the rest of the components in the urine. And actually, something that is pretty common is these Brita jars that you have home to filter water that actually works with adsorption of unactivated carbon. And with this process, what we achieve is we isolate the urea from the urine in the activated carbon, so we reduce the energy that we will need in the next steps of the process. Okay, so moving to the second step, what we do now is with this activated carbon, we apply a thermal treatment so that we regenerate the carbon and we can use it again. So what you can see now in the figure in the left is how much urea we can recover in the carbon during consecutive adsorption and desorption cycles. This means we pick a batch of carbon, we use it for recovering urea, we apply the thermal treatment, and we remove the urea. And that same batch of carbon, we use it again for recovery, 5 times in a row. And what you can see is that the capacity for removing urea is pretty constant, which means that we can use the same batch of carbon during a lot of time, which means the process will be much more sustainable and cheap if we scale up. Furthermore, during this regeneration, what we achieve is that the urea decomposes and produces ammonia. So we are transforming our hydrogen that was in the urea, and now we have it in the form of ammonia. And that leads me to the last step of the process, where we take the ammonia that we produce in step 2 and decompose it using a catalyst to produce hydrogen, which is our final energy vector. Okay, lot of science. But how this looks in real life? Well, this is the laboratory setup that we built and constructed to study the adsorption and desorption of urea. So in the column, we have the activated carbon, and then we study the adsorption with a peristaltic pump. So we measure how much urea we can recover from urine. And for the desorption, we increase the temperature, so we measure the ammonia on the back of the panel. But we didn't stop there, and we wanted to scale the process a little bit further. So we built a full-scale prototype to study the adsorption of urea from urine, which consists of a waterless urinal. So it's waterless because it doesn't use water, because we want the urine to be as concentrated as possible. And then we designed and installed an integrated adsorption system, which is on the back of the urinal. And, well, with this prototype, we get valuable information of how this process works in real conditions, which are, and trust me, they are very different from lab-scale experiments where you have everything under control and everything goes smoothly. And yeah, and we saw that the results obtained here are actually comparable to the lab experiment with similar capacities for removal of urea. Okay, so I told you now that we can produce hydrogen from the urea that is present in urine, that we developed a process and it's technologically feasible, but it's interesting in terms of energy recovery because I told you that we have to heat the carbon, so we have to invest energy to produce this hydrogen. Well, we made the calculations and the answer is yes, it's interesting. So just now for quantifying the impact, we are going to make an assumption. So we are going to assume that I convince you all today that this solution is the future. Just start to talk with your friends here in Cambridge, and well, in a year or so, every one of those 100,000 inhabitants here in Cambridge has one of these urinals installed at home, and all the urine that we produce here is treated by my process. I know it's going to happen, yeah. Well, if that happens, then we could be able to produce up to 140 tons per year of hydrogen, which is enough to go around the world 400 times. If instead of using a car you want to produce electricity in a fuel cell, that would mean 800 megawatts hour per year of electricity, which is equivalent to 1,500 solar panels production. And we will also have some side benefits, like we will be reducing the amount of nitrogen that reaches the wastewater treatment plants. And I told you before that's energy expensive. So the wastewater treatment plants will reduce their energy demand by 30%. Finally, we will reduce the CO2 emissions by 200 tons per year. Okay, so to wrap up, we are going to ignore these conclusions and just say that we have developed a process to efficiently recover energy from human urine based on the recovery of the urea and its transformation in hydrogen. I'm just going to tell you that I'm not based in Cambridge at the moment, but I'm doing the industrial part of my PhD in Aqualia, which is a Spanish water company. And this is the wastewater treatment plant of Lleida in Spain. Here, we carry out several innovation projects to enhance the energy self-sufficiency of the plant, such as the optimization of fat removal, the co-digestion to produce biogas, and the improvement of this biogas to use it in cars or in fuel cells. And it's here in this building where we actually do the research from Urine, where we have the lab, and where the full-scale urinal that I showed you before is installed. And we all that work there, we use it, and all the visitors, and it's working fine up to now. So that's all by my side. Thank you very much for your attention. And I know I'm the last one, but I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you very much, Rubén. Now's your chance, everyone. Any burning questions?
Thank you for this excellent talk. Very, very interesting. Out of curiosity, is it possible to use the ammonia directly rather than decomposing it into hydrogen? Because I read that the production of ammonia produces a lot of, or uses a lot of energy as well. So I was wondering maybe we could even stop earlier in the chain and use that product directly.
Yes, and that's an excellent question, and that's something that we are working on. So the whole project came from the idea of producing hydrogen from the nitrogen compound. So that's why we designed the process reaching hydrogen. But actually, you're right, and ammonia is a very, very interesting product. I mean, you could use it for producing fertilizers. You can even produce electricity skipping the hydrogen part with ammonia fuel cells that are now arising. And the idea here is not to transform in situ the ammonia into hydrogen, but to hold the energy in the form of ammonia, because the ammonia occupies much less space because it's liquid than hydrogen. So yeah, ammonia is probably, if this scales in reality, how the energy will be stored, not in hydrogen form. So yeah, excellent question, thank you.
Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. Yeah, so the sort of first implementation was with a urinal. Going forward with it, do you plan to try and like attach the preliminary processing to toilets, or would the idea be more that like a urinal for just liquid waste is also installed in every household?
So I think one of the limitations of this is how the social acceptance will be. So it's very unlikely that you are going to install something like this at home. But what I think it can be developed is, for example, think of an airport or something like that. You have a lot of people that go through an airport and use the toilets. So if you just divert the urine lines of all the toilets and build a big column with activated carbon where you can develop the process, then you will make a huge impact in just one location. So yeah, that's how I think this process has to move forward. I mean, I use this representation of, well, we are going all to install in Cambridge the system because it's very easy to quantify the impact. But actually, in a real scenario, I think that airports or maybe events where you have these portable toilets, that's actually a very good target for this process.
Awesome, thanks.
It was essentially the same question, but
Okay.
just definitely, this is very interesting, and the science of it is definitely above me. But I was just wondering, in just main structural terms, is the system of this, if it's been reproduced also in a toilet setting rather than a urinal, just because that's just not how women pee.
I know.
But also, like, would that require, which is where this question becomes the same question as before, a different toilet that is specifically only to pee in?
Yes. So yeah, we developed the urinal because, of course, it's much easier for building and for designing. But actually, there are already a system that separate the urine and the what is called black water in sitting toilets, like the one that you can see here in the figure. I think the limitation here is that you need to have in the sewer system of wherever this is installed, let's say the airport, you have to have the yellow line, the yellow water line, and the black water line separated because you don't want to mix the urine and the rest of the wastewater that you produce. But you can install something like this, and that shouldn't be very difficult to install in already commercially available toilets. So yeah, there are developments. I mean, we went to the urinal because it's much easier for the research.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, just quickly, because you were talking about black water. Is there also something we can extract from black water that we can?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's a lot of things that we can extract from black water. And there are a lot of projects that focuses on that because it also holds part of the nutrients. So if you don't divert the system and you don't separate the yellow and the black water and you go all together, there are a lot of projects that focus on recovery of nutrients to produce fertilizers directly from that, especially in developing countries where they have more limitations. And yeah, also in wastewater treatment plants, we already recover resources. So what we produce is biogas to produce energy, and that comes essentially from the organic matter that comes from the toilets. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of potential there, and a lot of things are already done.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So we saw from your decomposition of urine to ammonia, you also got carbon dioxide, and I wasn't quite sure how that contributed to your CO2 mass balance that you presented at the end.
Yes.
Could you comment?
Yeah, of course. So the mass balance, the CO2 emissions that I mentioned at the end, is just considering that all the energy that we produce and or save doesn't come from the normal mix, which produces CO2. Actually, the process will produce CO2, but that CO2 will be produced anyway. So in wastewater treatment plants, that organic matter will eventually become CO2. So the amount of CO2 is the same, but we will be saving the amount of the CO2 produced in producing the electricity that we will be producing without that footprint, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have time for, yes, one last question. There you go.
Thanks for the talk. I've been wondering how sensitive is the whole process of using the urine to like some sort of impurification? Because if it's installed in public spaces, people threw all kind of stuff into toilets, and yeah, how sensitive is it, and how does it threat your goal?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in the urine, we have urea, is the main compound, and it's like probably 100 times in the higher concentration than the second one. But it has a lot of things, not only that. So when we change from synthetic urea solutions, ideal solutions, to real urine samples, it already is a drawback of the process. So the efficiency of the absorption decreases by half, something like that. So if you add things that people can throw through the toilet, that's also a limitation. But we are working now on see if a pretreatment of the urine will make sense in terms of economic balance, or if maybe we can survive with that at the end. As long as we can recover some energy, even if it's less, well, it's okay. Maybe it's not worth it to install something that you can, to pretreat the urine and optimize the process. That's something that we are working on now. I mean, of course, if you throw something very, very weird to the toilet, then, well, probably it's going to make a mess. But hopefully not.
Okay, and with that, thank you very much, Rubén.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Okay, and that concludes the sessions for today. Thank you all very much for coming. And we hope to see you tomorrow. We will be reconvening at 11:30, but you're welcome anytime as of 11. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you tomorrow.